Hello and welcome. We're joined today by Tony Brown, who's a former artist in residence here at Hesston College and who has worked extensively with the life and legacy of Paul Robeson. His biography, American Baritone Anthony Brown, promotes peace and reconciliation through his music. His work takes him to political hotspots in Africa, South America, Europe, and Asia. His stirring performances connect people across race, language, religion, and culture, and help them focus on how we're each a part of the greater family of humanity. Much like Paul Robeson, Brown believes that our love of music makes us one. Thank you, Tony, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Tony. Just to maybe get us started, can you maybe connect us to your personal experience with Paul Robeson's work? Why should students be aware of him? And how did you learn about Paul Robeson and experience his work?
Well, having spent my formative years in the African American community and having parents who held Paul Robeson in high esteem, I remember so well as a child listening to his recordings
Hmm.
and hearing that deep, resonant bass voice, and then seeing pictures of this tall man, a great physique, and imposing presence. And so I knew Paul Robeson, and I knew of Paul Robeson as a child, and mainly because of his singing. But I also knew that he was quite the social activist. So that's kind of how I learned about him.
Mhm.
And, we could speak for days about his accomplishments. I mean, he was valedictorian of his graduating class in 1922 at Rutgers. He was an attorney, he was a star of the stage and screen. He was Phi Beta Kappa, lettered in all of the sports
Mhm.
when he was at Rutgers. Uh, he could speak fluently 20 different languages. He was just somebody who stood head and shoulders above the rest. And so,
In some cases, literally.
and in some cases, literally, yes. And so I thought, students, not just students, but that people more generally need to know who this man was and something of his accomplishments and the impact he made on a generation.
Mhm.
So, and it really, I mean, I guess maybe I would say that this maybe was supposed to happen. Maybe I don't know. In 2002, I went to Bosnia and I sang in a theater that was comprised of Jewish people, Serbs, Croats, Muslims, Christians, and um, and I was astonished when, at the end of the concert, these groups who have not been kind to each other jumped out of their seats and started applauding. And in that moment, there was this kind of oneness
Hmm.
that happened in that space. And out of well, I just never forgot that moment. And Robeson sort of came back into my consciousness because he used art, music especially, but also his oration ability. He's a orator. He was an orator, and the depth of his voice only added to the eloquence of what
Mhm.
he was putting out there. Just amazing.
Mhm.
And so maybe 8 or 9 years later, I'm working on a project trying to get a Native American singer and artist and a cowboy singer and artist
Mhm.
and me to do a program together. And I had to go to Santa Fe to meet the Native American artist, and I was picked up by his manager. And over the course of those 2 days that I was there, the manager turns out that he was also a playwright and asked me, what is something you really want to have happen in your life? I said, well, I want to do a show on the life of Paul Robeson.
Hmm.
He said, well, I'd be happy to collaborate with you on this and write something for you you could look at. And so out of that, that's how this show emerges.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that experience in Bosnia really did help to inspire
Hmm.
it.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little about sort of the show and the format, and sort of what that's like for those that haven't experienced it?
Yeah, the show is multimedia. So we got the rights to the PBS video footage, and so throughout, it's sort of like a documentary and a concert at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the PBS video footage that runs throughout the show, and we have a narrator who uh, who sort of he tells the story of Robeson's life in between these songs and then my speaking and describing, speaking and singing and describing certain events in Paul's life, whether it's his relationship to his father or the period when he was blacklisted. But I also help to weave the story too. And then there's a pianist.
Mm-hmm.
We are currently working on a revised show so that we have two different kinds of shows. And the revised one would be that the video, the narrator, and the pianist would be all on one disc.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just have to appear and just put the disc in this machine, and all of that stuff would just come on, and then I could just travel by myself.
Mm-hmm.
But one other important part of this show is the two appearances of Pete Seeger. And Pete knew Paul Robeson, collaborated with Paul Robeson, and he speaks about one of the events that they shared at Peekskill, the Peekskill riots. And it's very dramatic, and he brings tremendous credibility and also popularity
Sure.
to the show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Robeson, as you know, faced many barriers throughout his life, including workplace discrimination. I believe that's part of the reason it sort of affected his law career, stereotyping, including in film, and political exile. How did these moments shape sort of his career as an artist, as as a film actor, musician? How did those events shape his life?
Well, long before he was all of those things that you mentioned, he was an African American situated in a period of time where he, no matter what his accomplishments were, where he was discriminated against because of his race. He grew up in his early years in Princeton, New Jersey. His father was a pastor. And his father, by the way, was incredibly influential on his life. Really did hold his feet to the fire, told him a B on his report card was not acceptable, and worked and tutored him. And he loved his father like no other. Uh, so he had a tremendous sense of pride about him, not arrogance, just pride that was honed by his father's tutelage and belief in his capacity and potential. So there was a part of him, despite the fact that he at Rutgers couldn't go out and sing with the other groups and the choirs that went out. He could only sing on campus. He was isolated into the segregated areas at Rutgers where he was. this all forms him, and he is extremely aware that he, despite all of these gifts, is going to meet resistance. And he did meet resistance uh, in many ways. He was so unhappy sometimes at the kind of films he was being cast in, not really happy with that. And of course, he was not happy with the fact that the man of his prominence and intellectual capacity had to enter in the back
Mhm.
of certain theaters, that he could not walk through the front door, or he this is a man by now with a tremendous amount of notoriety, and he couldn't walk into a restaurant and just sit down and order from a menu like we can do today.
Mhm.
He was very aware that he was subordinate, or at least seen by those in the dominant culture. I think his legacy um, is so well typified in the song Old Man River, where he changes the lyrics. At the last part, the original words are, I gets weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living, but scared of dying. But Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along. Well, he changed that and said, I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along. Now, the folks who wrote the song were not very happy with him taking that kind of freedom. In fact, the one said, I think he should write his own damn song if that's what he wanted. Those were the words that they used. Uh, but we're talking about somebody whose legacy in all of these categories that you mentioned is a fearless honesty and a commitment to justice and human rights uh, in every category. This is a man who, after he graduated from Rutgers University in law, he moved to New York to go to the Columbia Law School, which he then got that degree. And when he got his first job, he called in the secretary to do some dictation, which was her job. She looked at him and said, I don't do dictation for the N word. And he got up from there and left that job and never was a professional lawyer in a legal setting.
Oh.
He moved right into the arts, but he took all of that spirit of striving for human rights and equality into the arts and used the arts as a way to speak out for justice and for his people and for people all over the world who were victims of all forms of oppression. And I think that's the legacy of Paul Robeson, somebody who cared enough to think about the least of these, to stand up and speak out.
Thank you. What have you learned from sharing Robeson's story with people? I imagine you've heard stories or seen how sort of these stories have impacted people and sort of how his life has impacted people. What's that experience been like, touring with that show and sort of sharing that story?
Well, one of my motivations for this show was to let the public know who this man was,
Hmm.
because he was uh, so amazing, that I wanted people to know. One of the things I learned was that so many people who were there had no idea who he was, and they thanked me. They said, "Where can we get books? How do we learn more?" Because it's such an impressive story. and a sad story in some ways as well. But one of the things, which is one of the reasons why I did it, is to give him, exposure. But I was not completely aware of the extent to which this man had been, kind of exiled and out of the spotlight. So that's one of the things I've learned. Another thing that I learned as I've traveled with this show is that when the African Americans who come to this show hear this show, they are overwhelmed, and they have a tremendous sense of pride for this man and who he was. In our materials for the show, we say before Rosa Parks, before Martin Luther King, before Nelson Mandela, there was Paul Robeson, and that puts him into some kind of context. And so, I'm always thrilled when I can speak about him with two African Americans, some of whom never heard who he was. I gave the show at Lincoln University, which is where Paul's father graduated not long ago, and the people there who came to the show had no idea that Paul's father was an alum there, had graduated from there, which kind of surprised me. And many of them did not know who Paul Robeson was, the students, especially the students. It makes it even more important to do
Mm-hmm.
the show. But I've also learned that just like he says, I get weary and sick of trying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. I've learned that there are people out there who care enough to want to be engaged in that too. I want to be engaged in that, and I learned that there are people who want to be engaged, and some people who knew who he was came just so that they could be refueled. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's like them having a dose of
Mm-hmm.
enthusiasm as something that can help to keep them in that struggle and keep them going. And I loved that too. I felt in solidarity with them in their efforts to do good wherever they live.
I think there's definitely something to be said about finding ways to return to that well, to be sort of renewed in that pursuit of justice and
Yes,
all
exactly.
that Robeson stood for.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Very true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for taking the time to share with us. And again, we're glad that you're able to share a little bit about your experience working with and sharing Paul Robeson's story with our film students.
Thank you very much, Donovan. I appreciate it, and it's nice to see you.
Yes, thank you.